Okay, so I'll be talking about kind of why we might sometimes decide to adapt an existing intervention to a new context rather than developing new interventions for every kind of problem in every context we're working in. There's some of the sort of motivations for developing the ADAPT guidance. I'll then talk about the development of the ADAPT guidance briefly, present the kind of framework and some of the key recommendations from this, so the kind of checklist of kind of questions to sort of think through when adapting an intervention to a new context. And I'll kind of finish with some sort of thoughts about what next, and in particular some kind of case examples of kind of large research programs that we're working on at the moment that are kind of trying to use this guidance in practice to see, well, to what extent it's actually kind of useful in sort of shaping intervention adaptation. Part of the motivation for kind of developing this guidance is just the idea that actually over the course of the last few decades, lots of evidence has accumulated on kind of what works for improving kind of outcomes in public health, in social care, growing kind of global evidence base. And actually, there's often an assumption interventions that have worked elsewhere are likely to be also produce good effects when they're implemented in new places. And in many respects, it's perhaps more efficient to be taking interventions that have a good evidence base from elsewhere and using them in new contexts than to be completely reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch with new interventions. Not always the case. I think there will always be kind of the need for the development of new interventions, but in many cases, when we're kind of trying to solve particular problems in a particular place, there are probably already quite good potential solutions out there that we could draw upon and build upon. I think there's lots of debate around kind of the role of context in the effectiveness of complex interventions and about the transferability of interventions from one time and place to another. I think sometimes context specificity, can't say that word, is, I should not include words on the slide that I can't say. That should be part of my rehearsal. It's sometimes exaggerated, and I think thinking back to a meeting I was in last year where we had some colleagues who'd been working in the local council in one kind of district in England. And they were saying that in lots of meetings where they raised the idea of using evidence-based interventions, the feedback we get from the council is, well, there aren't any interventions that apply to our context because there's not a university in this council. And you're like, well, there's one in each council either side, and they're generating lots of evidence. So is your kind of county really so different that none of that applies here? And I think sometimes there is this kind of drive for kind of ultra local evidence, this assumption that actually contexts are so unique and so different that actually you need to kind of generate evidence kind of in situ. But I think sometimes people do kind of exaggerate differences between contexts and focus on kind of actually aspects of contextual difference which might not necessarily matter to whether an intervention can be implemented here or whether it would work if it is implemented well. And there are lots of examples from the literature of interventions that have kind of travelled quite well across seemingly very different contexts. There are lots of examples from the parenting literature, for example, where interventions transported to kind of lower income contexts have been kind of compared to locally developed interventions and have actually tended to compare quite favourably. But there are also lots of examples. I know some people here were involved in the trial of the Strengthening Families programme in Wales that ran about a decade ago, I think. And that's an example of an intervention that was first evaluated in the US, showed lots of evidence of promise, but 5 trials across Europe have since failed to replicate the kind of successful kind of outcomes of that US intervention. So lots of interventions do translate quite well from one place to another, but there are kind of lots of cases where really promising interventions have been kind of used in a new time and place, tested again, and just haven't worked. And I don't think necessarily all of this transferability failure is down to contextual differences, and there are lots of reasons why interventions might have worked in one time and place and not work elsewhere. This is where I'm regretting including animations on the slide because that's a bit lower. So first of all, it's quite likely in lots of cases that actually the intervention just wasn't well enough described in the first place for its kind of deeper sort of functions and meanings to be kind of reproduced and replicated in a new context. So sometimes when we take an intervention from elsewhere, deliver it somewhere new, it might be that only the kind of surface features of that intervention are being reproduced, and actually it's that failure to kind of reproduce the essence of the intervention in a new context because we haven't kind of got a deep enough understanding of what it actually was that leads to failure to transfer. It might be that actually in a new context you're working with a different set of local resources, different set of kind of local norms, and actually it's just not possible to implement it in the way that it was implemented in the original context. It's not possible to actually kind of implement it in ways that its kind of functions do represent what the original intervention was. I think there's also, I mean, going again, kind of looking at some of the kind of parenting literature, I think there's quite a long history of kind of interventions from the US that have shown quite good effects, kind of family-based interventions being transferred to places like Sweden and having absolutely no effect at all. And what a lot of the literature kind of puts this down to is kind of differences in usual care between those contexts. Actually, lots of those interventions from the US aren't kind of as different as from kind of what's already there in Sweden. They don't kind of make as much difference to kind of usual care, and therefore they don't kind of, when you kind of trial their effects relative to usual care, they're not actually any better than what's already there. But in some cases, we might also see that where interventions have been kind of adapted for use in new contexts, they end up being adapted in ways that kind of undermine the functioning of the intervention. So sometimes interventions that have been tested in a randomized control trial or other kind of robust evaluation method design, they're actually very difficult to take to scale. Sometimes they're too long, too intense. And when people use them in other contexts, often they'll try and shorten them. They might increase the kind of group sizes. They'll make alterations which can potentially kind of have quite big implications for the dynamics of the intervention, how it kind of functions. So it might be that some of the adaptations that are being made do actually kind of undermine whether the intervention will work or not. And of course, there's always the possibility that replication failure is simply a signal that the intervention never really worked in the first place. It might well be that even if you kind of base your kind of decisions to use this intervention on kind of a really good quality evaluation from elsewhere, perhaps that was just a fluke and it never really worked. So it might be people have kind of posited this argument around kind of the Strengthening Families program as an example, that perhaps it's not that it didn't transfer well to other contexts, perhaps it never really worked in the first place. Or there may be cases where actually genuinely, even if you are able to implement the intervention as intended, it just doesn't work in the new context because the mechanisms driving the problem in your context are kind of different. So in some cases, if we think of interventions from a kind of realist perspective as being kind of attempts to introduce mechanisms that are sufficiently suited to their context to bring about change, then if the contextual contingencies necessary for an intervention to work aren't present, even if you implement it well, it might not bring about the same changes. Thinking about through some of these questions does kind of introduce kind of key sort of challenges, I guess, in how we can select interventions from elsewhere that might work and what kind of adaptations might be necessary to ensure that they can be implemented in the new context, have the best possible chance of working, and that we don't kind of undermine the sort of functional integrity of the original intervention if we are kind of trying to sort of reproduce its kind of mechanisms across a new context. I think in reality, often when we look at examples of where interventions have been taken from elsewhere, retested in new places, and have worked as kind of the original intervention had, or have failed to reproduce those effects, often it's very kind of difficult to get any kind of grasp on kind of what changes have been made, why, what the rationale was for selecting that intervention in the first place. There's often kind of very little kind of transparency around the processes through which adaptation was undertaken. So I think it can often, when we see interventions fail to transfer, be very difficult to adjudicate between all of those different kind of explanations that we talked about on the last slide. Okay, so the ADAPT study was funded in 2018 by the MRC NIHR Methodology Research Programme, and I talked about some guidance documents that were funded by that programme last week. It's changed its name since this. I think it's called Better Methods, Better Research now. Co-PIs on this were myself and Rhiannon Evans, who's a former Health and Care Research Wales fellow herself. She held a social care fellowship some years ago. Actually, we both kind of sat next to each other during our PhDs, and now we're kind of Rhiannon's a reader and I'm a professor in Decipher 10 years later. This was a kind of five university collaboration, and initially that slightly expanded because we had a kind of advisory group who worked from universities other than those kind of involved as co-investigators, and many of our advisory group ended up making such large contributions that they became kind of co-authors on the guidance as well. So it ended up being a 8-university collaboration, I think, across the UK nations and Australia and Germany. But we're aiming to provide guidance on selecting appropriate interventions for adaptations. So what interventions do you choose in the first place? How do we kind of plan for and undertake adaptations? How do we make decisions around things like if we're taking an intervention from elsewhere, bringing it to a new context, implementing it again, how much uncertainty does that really reintroduce? At what stage do you say the evidence is so good that you just go ahead and do it? Or at what stage do you think, well, there's so much uncertainty or whether this will transfer, we need to do a whole new randomized trial or other evaluation as if it was kind of a new intervention. We also kind of touched on kind of implementing interventions at scale. Actually, I think as we got to the later stage of the guidance, it starts to kind of collapse into scale out and scale up guidance and kind of sort of implementation science. So that was kind of lots of signposting to elsewhere. And also kind of briefly talk about reporting the processes of adapting interventions to new contexts. And then this was being developed alongside a lot of other developments in MRC guidance, MRC kind of NIHR funded guidance, lots of which we talked about kind of last week. So and are in the kind of webinar that will be on the website shortly. I think just a kind of couple of kind of key points before I kind of start talking about the guidance itself. I think one of the key challenges in terms of kind of defining what adaptation was is where adaptation becomes intervention developments, if there is a clear separation between the two of those, or whether they end up sort of blurring into each other sometimes. And Alicia O'Cahoon and colleagues had recently been funded to lead the index guidance, so guidance on intervention development. So Alicia and Pat Hodinott, who are the lead investigators on that, were part of our team in ADAPT as well to try and kind of ensure that these were kind of complementary. I think new interventions do often involve kind of synthesizing principles from prior interventions. They rarely kind of start completely from scratch. And in lots of cases, I think actually new interventions involve kind of molding together kind of various prior interventions. But I think by kind of adaptation, we were kind of talking about, and this kind of was consistent with how the index guidance framed adaptation, taking a kind of single defined intervention and making changes to kind of improve its fit with a new context. And I don't think it's kind of either or. You're not either doing adaptation or intervention developments. In many cases, people will start out with a single intervention they're adapting and end up kind of augmenting that with additional kind of local components. In some cases, I think you might start with one particular intervention in mind and kind of end up adapting it so much that you realise that it's actually become a fundamentally different intervention. The theory of change is completely different. Actually, you are kind of moving into kind of the territory of developing a new intervention. It's no longer really the original. It's a bit like the, probably showing my age, but thinking about kind of Only Fools and Horses, the kind of triggers broom thing, where he talks about having had this same broom for 30 years and only having replaced the handle 10 times and the head 5 times. You start out with an intervention and end up changing so much, it can sometimes become something completely new. I think our guidance, we kind of hoped that this would build on the MRC guidance for developing and evaluating interventions, which was being updated at the time. And this was due to be published originally in 2019. At that stage, we were due to be kind of picking up our work and kind of taking forward the kind of systematic review work and developing our guidance. But actually, these ended up being much more parallel processes rather than sequential, just because the MRC guidance was delayed by a couple of years. So there are some kind of minor differences in the use of terminology across them. So the new MRC guidance does kind of, whereas the previous version focused on this kind of first blob on the left as being kind of intervention development, there wasn't kind of much mention of kind of identifying existing interventions for kind of natural experiments. There also wasn't much mention then of kind of adapting existing interventions for new contexts. So that was kind of introduced. I think here, adaptation is very much kind of framed as a form of intervention development, which is kind of slightly different to how it was framed in Index and the ADAPT guidance. And actually, I think most of the kind of innovation in adaptation that we were kind of covering in our systematic reviews comes from the field of implementation science rather than kind of intervention development. I think in terms of terminology as well, the MRC guidance talks about refining the intervention at all stages. I think we started out kind of talking about refinement, but that term, the conceptual distinction between that and kind of responsive adaptations, making adaptations as you move through the phases, just kind of slightly collapsed. And I think our stakeholders in the literature didn't generally talk about refinement, it tended to talk about kind of responsive adaptation. So there are areas where kind of the guidance documents, I think, are using slightly different language, but essentially kind of talking about very similar things. In terms of the methods that we used for developing the ADAPT guidance, so we have 4 work packages. Work package 0, the overarching kind of integration and synthesis and guidance development work package. But feeding into that, we had for the first year, Eva Rayfus and her team in LMU Munich led 2 systematic reviews. The first was a systematic review of what guidance is already out there for adapting interventions to new contexts. And there was lots that was being published as we were going through the course of developing ours. So we ended up kind of signposting to lots of work coming out of North America on kind of adapting interventions while kind of focusing on not undermining core functions. Lots of kind of places were actually in our guidance rather than developing something new. We are kind of signposting to lots of things that were emerging as we were going along. The second work package following the systematic reviews, Rhiannon kind of led the kind of qualitative work, interviewing people who've been involved in developing interventions to new contexts. And I forgot I've got animations on this one as well. So this was just a kind of editorial that we published kind of initially, just to kind of set out what the rationale was for this guidance, what we were planning to do. The 2 systematic reviews that were led by Annie Moxisyan within Eva Rayfus's team were published in Implementation Science and another journal, the name of which I can't remember now, and I can't read that because it's too far away and too small. The kind of qualitative work package that Rhiannon led to 2 papers that were published in the PLOS One and BMJ Open. Following on from the kind of qualitative work, Peter Craig and colleagues in Glasgow led the kind of Delphi work to kind of develop kind of and test some recommendations. And the paper on the right kind of describes the kind of protocol from that. The paper on the left is kind of a paper that we wrote following kind of a meeting kind of midway through to kind of review what we've done so far and think about what kind of directions we're going forward. And then the final guidance was published in the BMJ about 1.5 years ago now. One of the benefits of getting published somewhere like BMJ is they have really good graphic design people there, because I sent some really wonky looking diagramming, and I'm generally terrible with diagrams. I'm not a very visual person, but I recognise that actually within these kind of MRC frameworks, the only thing that people ever remember is the diagram. So you do need one. I mean, I remember like my very first PhD student used to always come to kind of supervisions with these really elaborate diagrams, and I'd be like, it's beautiful, but I've got no idea what it means. I need words. But I sent in this diagram and they turned it into something that actually kind of made some sense. So here we kind of frame stakeholder involvement as kind of an overarching principle rather than the kind of key step of adapting interventions to new contexts. And we think about step 1 as being, and I realise this is probably testing the eyesight of people back quite badly, having been sat there myself earlier. Step 1 is around kind of assessing the sort of rationale for intervention and considering the potential intervention context fit of existing interventions. And it might be from that stage we recognise that there aren't really any suitable interventions available, so we kind of exit use of this guidance and move to develop a new intervention instead. It might be if we do identify one potentially suitable intervention or multiple interventions that we need to choose from. And we might then move to kind of step 2, thinking about kind of planning for and undertaking adaptations. I mean, in reality, lots of teams probably enter at step 2, having, for whatever reason, already identified an intervention, and then kind of moving to sort of starting to think about, well, how do we need to adapt this? But I think it's still then useful to kind of reflect back on, well, why was this intervention chosen in the first place? Is it really the most appropriate one? Where we've kind of planned for kind of an undertaken adaptations, that could lead us to a conclusion that it's unlikely to fit with the context without further kind of adaptations, which might kind of take us back to kind of selecting a new intervention or out to intervention development. Or we might decide that actually, with adaptations, this has promise and move forward to evaluation. Whatever evaluation work we're doing, we kind of might come to a conclusion that it's kind of feasible and we can take it forward. It's likely to be effective, or we might decide that there's so much uncertainty that we need to do a whole new evaluation. And those considerations will kind of inform whether we kind of move forward to scale up or kind of exit the framework and move to intervention development or back to earlier stages. So there's a bit of a kind of ball of spaghetti, but I think there is a kind of logical flow to it. And I think the diagram even makes sense to me, which is unusual. As well as the kind of framework, the sort of mandatory MRC funded guidance diagram, we developed a kind of checklist of kind of considerations, things to sort of think through at each stage of adapting an intervention to a new context. And it's kind of a series of kind of recommendations and questions to consider. And these were kind of based on kind of priorities which were identified through the kind of systematic review, through the Delphi phase, through the qualitative interviews and kind of discussions amongst the research team and our advisory group. And I think one thing to kind of emphasize here is that working to the checklist doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be doing more research to answer every single question. It might well be that lots of those questions are already kind of answerable through what you already know about the intervention or the existing kind of literature. And I think one kind of potential unintended consequence of the kind of lots of guidance that we've seen coming out around complex interventions over the last 10 years or so is that there is a bit of a risk that those generate kind of really bloated research studies that end up trying to do everything. So I think one of the things we try to do here, and it's quite strongly reflected, I think, in the new MRC guidance update, is this focus on identifying systematically what are the kind of key uncertainties, what are the areas where new research is needed, and what are the areas where actually the literature tells you enough, you already know the answers to these things. So the idea being kind of to generate sort of more focused research rather than kind of more research. So I'll just talk through these very, very briefly. I mean, they're all kind of listed in the paper or the full guidance that I can signpost to later. But I think we included quite a lot of guidance and recommendations around kind of forming your kind of adaptation team, thinking about kind of whether you've kind of included an appropriate sort of range of stakeholders, so people who understand the original intervention, the evidence, people who understand the new context, if those are the things that you're trying to make fit with one another. Clarity on kind of roles, who's going to make decisions and how. I think one question that our kind of advisory groups and stakeholders talked about a lot was how you involve the original developers of the intervention, the processes for doing that, potential conflicts of interest that might arise from that, and how you kind of manage them. So kind of being transparent in kind of how, to what extent developers are involved, what kind of input they had into decision making. And then that came up in particular when we were talking to a lot of kind of global health colleagues, who were kind of saying, actually, if you give too much power to original intervention developers who've developed these programs in high income countries, and they end up kind of having quite a lot of sway in kind of saying what's right for kind of people in kind of lower income contexts, that creates a lot of kind of difficult kind of power dynamics. So I think lots of these things are kind of things to think through, and things where there aren't necessarily any kind of right answers, but actually it's quite useful to be kind of clear from the outset how you're going to approach them. Then just moving forward to thinking about the rationale for the intervention and thinking about how the intervention and the concepts kind of fit with each other. I mean, obviously, with any research, you start out by thinking about, well, what is the problem that we're seeking to address? What's the target population that we're working with? But also, as I mentioned, it might be that your kind of literature search work identifies kind of more than one potential intervention. If so, are there reasons why one is more suitable than another? What are your reasons for thinking this is the intervention to use? What do we actually know already from kind of prior evaluations of this intervention in the original context? Any other evaluations that have happened since, kind of elsewhere? If we are taking an intervention from elsewhere and using it in a new context on the basis that intervention has worked previously, how robust are those claims that it has actually worked previously? Has it only ever been shown to work in one small study by the intervention developers? Is there a range of different evidence which points in the same direction? And then kind of considering, well, how similar and different are the original and new contexts? And all contexts are different, but not all differences matter. Interventions can sometimes transfer very well to seemingly very different contexts. But if it's possible to implement the intervention and the mechanisms through which the intervention works are relevant to that new context, then lots of other contextual differences might not necessarily matter. And also, I think one other thing that our stakeholders talk about quite a lot is kind of intellectual property issues. For lots of interventions, there are kind of issues around whether you can just take them elsewhere and adapt them to a new context. Original developers often kind of retain quite a lot of control over how their interventions are used elsewhere. I think there is a big move kind of globally and internationally towards kind of more open source interventions. And it might be in some cases that if the intervention you want to work with, there are too many restrictions on how it can be adapted to kind of make it work here, you might need to kind of look at using something else, or kind of developing something kind of open source which draws on some of its principles. But thinking about kind of planning for undertaking adaptations, so all the work earlier will kind of identify kind of what are the kind of constraints and facilitators to potentially implementing this new intervention, and the considerations which might kind of feed into judgments about whether it's likely to kind of work. I swear, how can you kind of work with those facilitators around those constraints? What adaptations can you make? Do you need to make to intervention materials, to manuals, to kind of document and capture all the changes that you're making to the intervention and document clearly what the rationale for all of those is? I think one of the things that some members of our advisory group, and I think Penny Hall, who became a co-author on the final guidance, was really keen to kind of include this, was around actually even if interventions kind of have the same intended effect in a new context, it is possible that because the contexts are different, they will have kind of unique unintended harms in the new context. So we do need to kind of also be thinking about, well, are there any kind of unintended consequences here that weren't relevant in the original context, or potentially vice versa? And then just thinking about, well, what are the costs and resources needed to deliver the intervention? Who will deliver it? How will they be kind of recruited? And then just finally to talk about, I'll talk about kind of some of the considerations around evaluation. So it might be that we're adapting something that has such a wealth of evidence from lots of different contexts, many of which are quite similar to our own, in which case we might make decisions that actually we can just go ahead and do this with relatively kind of light touch evaluation. It might be that actually we're changing things so much that we feel like we need a completely new evaluation around this, because the uncertainty of whether it will work or not is so great that we really do need to kind of start from scratch. We talk about kind of the value, thinking about the value of information to policymakers, and what resources are available for evaluation, whether we need to kind of make kind of further adaptations once we've done initial kind of feasibility or piloting work, processes for kind of capturing adaptations that are made as the intervention kind of beds into practice, and then sort of thinking about, well, do we need to reevaluate effectiveness, cost effectiveness, process, and how are we going to go about doing that if we do? And here, I mean, by the time we got to kind of thinking about, well, what are the considerations for taking this to scale, I think we kind of recognised there wasn't really much new that we could contribute here above and beyond what's already out there and kind of scale up an implementation science literature. Because once you've gone through all these phases of identifying your intervention, adapting it, kind of evaluating it in a new context, actually the considerations next are very similar to what they might be if you were just taking a sort of de novo developed intervention to scale. So we didn't really kind of include a lot at this stage, just kind of flag that actually these are kind of important things to be considering and thinking about kind of throughout the whole process, really. So one of the things I talked about quite a bit last week is there's been a huge amount of guidance that's come out over the last 10, 15 years or so. And I think sometimes there's a tendency for this guidance to kind of come out and for there to be very little consideration given to how it's being used. Is it actually kind of achieving its goals? Is it kind of creating kind of unintended consequences? So I think personally, I'll probably be kind of trying to take a bit of a step back from kind of developing any new guidance over the next few years and just thinking about, well, how can we kind of generate case examples and kind of reflect on how useful what's out there already is. And you think of guidance as being kind of an intervention in and of itself. And really simplified logic model, I told you I wasn't very good at sort of diagrams, but essentially you can think of guidance as being about trying to inform better research decisions, which in turn leads to better research, which in turn kind of leads to better outcomes for the public and for patients. But actually, is it the case that guidance is doing that? And I think I talked about some examples last week about how actually some recommendations might simply be leading to sort of bloated research or to kind of excessive over-testing of certain things that aren't necessarily kind of that uncertain. So I'll give kind of a brief overview now, just of some examples of how we might kind of use guidance like this. Some programs of work that we've got at the moment have only started over the course of the last year or so, using this guidance in various different contexts for adapting interventions. The first one is a program that started in 2021, like almost immediately after this guidance was finished. And it's a 4-year kind of research program, the last year and a half of which is the bit that I'll be leading around kind of adapting school-based interventions. And there's lots of evidence out there around what school environment-based interventions can be helpful for preventing depression in young people. But actually, we also know that autistic young people and young people with ADHD are at much higher risk of developing depression. And actually, school can often be quite a toxic environment for neurodivergent young people. It can be an environment where their differences and the way that they interact with those contexts can kind of really damage their kind of self-concept, lead to very high levels of stress, impact on their kind of regulatory capacity in lots of kind of quite problematic ways. So I guess one of the questions here is, can we take kind of existing school environment interventions and adapt those so they do work well for neurodivergent young people? And here, no intervention has been pre-selected. We will be going through a process of kind of identifying what interventions are out there and potentially kind of selecting one or more of those for adaptation. But actually, what a lot of that work so far has shown is that lots of existing approaches to emotional regulation to prevent depression in schools draw on things like CBT, which we actually know from lots of literature don't tend to work as well for many kind of neurodivergent young people. So actually, it might be that lots of the models out there already just won't work for the populations that we're particularly interested in, and that actually something completely new might need to be developed. So here we're starting off thinking, well, we might adapt existing things if there are kind of suitable interventions available. But if kind of theoretically it looks like the things that are being used already are unlikely to work for the groups we're particularly interested in, we might have to exit this framework and develop new interventions instead. Another program was just started a few months ago. It's funded by the NIHR Global Health Research Fund. And this is looking at interventions to support people with dementia and their carers. And there's effective intervention models that have been developed over the last few years in the US, which have kind of focused on, because there's this kind of shortage of skilled kind of medical expertise in dementia, kind of relative to the kind of growing problem, the kind of aging population. So this intervention is focused on task shifting, so training non-specialist care navigators to support people with dementia and their carers, to help kind of signpost them to existing local resources. And this program is funded to kind of look at transferring that model from the US to Peru, where obviously you have very different social care and very different kind of health infrastructure. And before I was brought into the team, they'd already selected the intervention, so they're kind of entering at stage 2, if you like. But at the same time, but from there, we're kind of reflecting, well, was this the right intervention to select? What's the reason to think that this is the most appropriate intervention? Were there alternatives available? What do we know about it? there's a huge amount of kind of evidence that's come out of the evaluations of the US interventions since our grant first went in. I mean, at the moment, just kind of working through that ADAPT checklist to kind of understand what we already know, what uncertainties we need to address, what might be some of the kind of unintended consequences. And kind of one of the key things we're looking for is looking at the moment around kind of adaptations of the delivery model. So in the US, we have kind of care navigators who are kind of trained to deliver kind of particular protocols. But in Peru, the kind of context to actually train those, the resource to train those people up is likely to be relatively limited. And so we're looking at whether some of those protocols might be automated and delivered via kind of artificial intelligence instead, with kind of oversight by kind of community health workers. So that's at very kind of early stages, started a few months ago. The kind of intervention adaptation work hasn't really started yet. And just the third example, this is a EU UKRI grant, which has it's been a massive headache to get this one started for obvious reasons. You might have heard of this thing called Brexit. But this grant went in, and we were supposed to be kind of coordinating an organisation from Cardiff, working with a number of institutions across Europe. We're looking at kind of family-based interventions for supporting adolescent mental health. And that the intervention is going to be focused on kind of Moldova and North Macedonia. Originally, we were kind of overall coordinating organisation, but obviously we're not eligible for Horizon funding at the moment. So the coordination has had to move to Austria. We've had to leave the grants into two separate grants, essentially, and UKRI fund the component of the activity that's happening here, whereas EU fund all the activity that's happening beyond that. So I've been swearing about Brexit quite a bit so far. That's been my most of my activity on this project. But yeah, again, the intervention is largely being kind of selected at the kind of grant development stage here. It's likely to involve kind of both adaptation, and here we're talking about largely, I think, pragmatic adaptations to kind of shorten an intervention to try and kind of deliver its core kind of essence, while delivering it in a form that could actually be kind of maintained at scale in lower sort of resource contexts. So there are always big risks, I think, that when you adapt things to make them more implementable, you actually also make them less effective at the same time. So those are going to be lots of the things we're looking at here. So in terms of where to find out more, we've got the full guidance document is available via this link here on the Decipher website, and the sort of boiled down summary guidance in the BMJ was published in 2021. We have got a study website which has all of the papers from the various work packages in kind of developing the guidance, and this is the link to that. All the materials we developed are published open access, so essentially you can do what you want with them, as long as the original source is credited. Should add that, I guess. So in terms of kind of acknowledgements, this is the quite long list of co-authors and other study contributors. Any questions, you can contact myself or Rhiannon, and yeah, it's the mandatory funding statements.